All right, this is 3.1, domain and range and interval notation. Those of you who were not in class or watching this video, the first page before these notes start, the page before this is where I wrote this information. So I'm going to write above, and just so you can copy it down there, that's where it came from. So we're going to talk about domain and range. Give yourself a little bit of room. Make sure that you have plenty of space to do it. So, okay. So first we're going to talk about, I'm just going to give us kind of reminders. So domain, when we talk about domain, we are talking about our X values, and I put a little quotes there because they're not always going to be X values. They're going to be whatever, if you're talking about costs or anything like that, but we use X values right now. And then it's also your independent variable. You get to choose what this variable be, and everything else depends on that, so it's independent. And this is all our inputs. These are the things that you put into the equation. These are the values, not the things, it could be things, but these are the values that you choose and you put in to the equations, the function, or that's the domain, okay? So when you think about a graph, what I want you to think about when you think about a graph, that you're looking from left to right. Okay? All right, next one is range. Range, we are talking about our Y values. This is also the dependent variable. You need to know what X is before you can get that answer. It depends on that domain. And then it is also the output. It's the answer that you get. Put that X in, plug it in, do some work, do some math, and get an answer out. When we go to look at the graph, I want you to think about low to high, bottom to top, whichever is easiest for you. And just to kind of give us an idea, when we're talking about the graph on this, we're looking this way on the graph. These values this way. Up here on the domain, you're looking for the values, it's going this way, okay? Now the next portion we're talking about, since it's talking about interval notation and all of our notation, we're doing notation here, okay? So this next section will be on notation. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have the proper notation when we use all these different things. So we're going to look at how we write that out, what it looks like, and then go do some work on, make sure we understand. So for notation, sorry, we're very sloppy then. Okay, so we have, first let's do the inequality. Okay, when you're talking about inequalities, you're talking about symbols like this, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Okay, when you have the equal to sign, that means that value, that number gets to be included. Okay, so I'm going to just write this above here. This is what the included, this is what it looks like when you get to be included. You get to use this equal to sign, okay, underneath here. That makes it included. Then we'll have one where it's not, has the equal sign, so therefore it's not included. And then that's what we'll just be doing, I'll just draw the other symbols. So if it's not included, you will have just less than or greater than. Now I want to put this these are inequality symbols, but I want to make sure that even though it's inequality symbols, that we do use the equal sign, okay? All right, so when something specifically equals just that number, that does happen, and you'll see some examples as we go along in our notes, okay? The next one I'm going to look at are the interval notation, what that looks like, okay? So for interval notation, we have brackets and parentheses only for interval notation. We do not use less than or equal to. So if it's included, as I have up here, then these will be brackets. If it's not included, then we're going to do parentheses. So now when you're looking at the graph, when you see a graph, when you look at the graph, the notation is going to look like it's going to be a closed circle. This helps us to determine how to write the two above. And then on the other way, it would be a closed circle if it's not included. So you can determine, do I write parentheses, do I write brackets, and so forth. So I'm going to do just a couple of other types of notation. The first one I want to look at is what infinity looks like. So infinity, when it has, when you're dealing with infinity, and you have to write the interval notation. So the interval notation will look like this. Infinity with interval notation is always going to be this, parentheses, okay? For inequality, it's going to be, usually we can use this symbol for, which stands for all real numbers. Okay. Okay, so one last notation that I want you to know is it's called union. The symbol is a U. Okay, and this is used when there are two or more intervals. All right, example number 1. I'm used to writing things as interval notation first. I just like how it makes it easier for me to write the inequality. You can do either one, but that's how I'll be showing in this video. So the first thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at my graph. Since it's going in this direction, this is all x values for us in a sense. It's just a straight number line. We're going to use x as our variable, and we just look left to right. So always go to smallest to largest. We always want to go smallest, no matter how we write it, smallest to the largest when we write our intervals. Okay, so if I look at this graph, I can see here that this is closed because it's definitely a closed circle, so that's included, and this is closed. So if I'm using closed, and that means I'll use a bracket. So I'm going to do a bracket. My lowest, smallest number here to the left is -3. All the way to the largest number here is 2, and then I will close the bracket. Okay. Now to write inequality, again, I like to write this way because right here, when we write inequality, we write it all together, okay? So I'm going to talk about as I write it so we make sure that we understand. So you always start with your smallest number first. So it's -3. Okay, it's negative. Now the way I'm going to write this next symbol is how we write this when it comes to inequalities. And there's two numbers here, and the numbers are all the values we get to use are in between those two numbers. So we will write the inequality going in this direction. X is less than or equal to, and it's equal to because of this symbol here. It's closed, so it's included, to the x value, which is less than or equal to, and then we'll do the 2. Now, the variable will always be in the middle, and then you always have the inequalities going in this direction. So I want to just really quick pause and kind of talk about why it works the way it does. So if I were to write just the first part, when I'm boxing out here, off to the side here, when you read this, you read from the variable to the number, this direction. Okay, it's backwards because we always start with the variable. So this says x is greater than or equal to the -3. Well, if I look at -3s here, all my x values are greater than or equal to -3, so that is true, okay? And then when I look at this other part, I'm doing in blue, it's still saying x is less than or equal to 2. So if I look where I'm ending into it, all these values are less than or equal to 2 until we get to that -3. So it is saying the same thing. Instead of writing it, and again, we would write this if we were going to write them separately, we would write it this direction. We combine them together, okay? And again, this is red. -3 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 2. So I'm going to erase this so that we can talk about it's less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 2. and again, this is red, -3 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 2. All right, so that's how we read it. So, okay. All right, so let's go on to the next one, number 2. Get this out of the way since we already talked about that. All right, so let's start from, again, I like to write my inequality, my interval notation first. So I'm going to start with this number here. That's my smallest. It's included. Therefore, I have a bracket. I start at -4, and I'm going to go up to this number right here, which is an open circle, not included. So it is going to be comma 1 with a parentheses. Now I have more to go. Okay. Now this is where the union comes in, because I'm doing more than one interval. So union, you just put a U, and it's just telling you that you're using both of these parts. And again, you're going to see this in your upper level college courses, not just upper level college courses, just your upper level courses and in college books and so forth. So I want you to be able to understand when you read it. You won't be nervous about what it looks like. So we start here. What's the smallest number in this section right here? Smallest number is 2. So it's included because it's got a closed circle. So I'm going to have a bracket. Now this is going on forever and ever in this direction. Okay, that means going on forever and ever to positive infinity. Okay, so now when you have 2 numbers here, you're going to write it. And again, this is why I like the interval notation, because straight up I know it's going to be a -4 here, which is less than or equal to x, x, which is less than 1. So the second part that we're going to write is for this part of this interval here. And this interval doesn't have another number, because remember, infinity is not a number, actual number. It is just an idea. You get to infinity, you keep going. So what you want to look at this is that you're going to go one direction forever. So when we write this, the variable goes first. Oh, sorry about that. The variable goes first. Okay. Then we're going to look at our number is going to go here. Now, what's the symbol that goes, the inequality symbol that goes in between? Well, we know it's included. Now, which way is it going? All these x values are greater than 2. Okay. So again, difference here is 2 numbers in my little interval here, but this one here, I have infinity, so I have to write it a little bit different. Okay, so now we're going on to a graph, and so that's part of that notation we talked about, or the information, kind of like a definition I was talking earlier about, making sure that when we look at a graph, what we're looking for. So when we talk about the domain, we are talking about our x values. So make sure that you remember you're talking about x values, okay? X values on the graph are left to right, okay? So when I go here and I look at my x values, and sometimes you may want to be careful when you look at your book there. Some of the axes doesn't look like they're at where they're supposed to be, and so I'll try to highlight them to make sure you see them. So if I look at the x values here for what my axis is, that is this here. I'm only going to care about what's happening here, okay? When I look at those values, I want to know what number to the farthest can I go to the left. Well, I go all the way over here, and this is the farthest number right here. It hits this graph. This x value, when I plug it in, we'll get to this graph. Okay, well, that x value is a -5. And it's closed. Okay, so now we want to keep going now and determine, as I go to the right, as these values go to the right, and I'm going to mess up my graph a little bit, all these x values are hitting the graph. So I'm going x up to the graph. Get an x, go to this graph. And it keeps going until, it doesn't matter what the y value is, what is the x doing? It keeps being used. Will it go past this 6? Yes, because the graph will extend out because of that arrow. So that means from everything from there, and this, if I keep going forever and ever this direction, is my positive infinity. that is the domain in interval notation. So now for an inequality, we're going to say that here is an infinity. So we know we have the variable x, and we know we have the -5, and then we got to look, okay, this is going on forever and ever to a positive direction, so this has to be greater than. The closed circle tells me to put the equal sign underneath. Okay, now we're going to talk about the range. Remember, the range are the y values. When I want the y values, I want to look at the graph, and I want to think of these values here. Okay? All right, so now we want to talk about the interval. We want to go to the smallest number to the highest number. So the smallest numbers, we're going to go down. How low does it go? Okay? So if I look at my graph, where does the y value start? The lowest point. So if you're looking now, again, I'm going to write all over my graph again. Let me do a different color. I want to know what y values are hitting this graph. I start there, and that's a -1. So I know it starts at -1, and it is a closed interval, so it's a bracket. And I keep going up. Everywhere I hit, no matter what my y value is, it's going to be up to here, and it stops right here. Since we're not going any farther and it stops at that number right there is 5. So it goes all the way up and it stops at 5. Oops, it should be a bracket because it's closed. And then now we write the inequality. We have two numbers. So we're going to start with the smallest one, -1, is less than or equal to y. Don't forget, it is a y. If you put an x, then it's incorrect. I'm not talking about domain, we're talking about range. It goes. All right, so let's look at number 4. So don't forget that we're talking about domain. We are talking about your x values. So again, I'm going to use my highlighter to kind of determine which way I'm looking at. So when we're talking about x values, we're talking this axis, right? Part of the axis right here, just those values there. And then we're going to look at what they do when they hit the graphs. So the first thing I want to do is do interval notation. I'm going to look at the left side of the graph, and I'm going to look at this graph over here. And I'm going to look at how far to the left do I get to go. And so when looking at this graph, this arrow kind of tells me this graph is going to go forever and ever. Okay, so it's going to go on there. So I know that whatever I pick an x value, it's going to be in that graph. No matter what, it's going to be part of this graph, okay? I'm just drawing those so that it's going to hit the graph. Best way to do it. So now I know I'm starting over here to the left. The farthest left I get to go is -infinity. And if it's infinity, I use a parentheses, so it's -infinity, comma. And then how far do I get to go to the right with this graph? Well, I'm going to go to right here to this value of -2. So I'm going to put a -2, and it's a closed circle, so it would be included. So there's a bracket. Now, when I look at the x values, and if I try to keep going, if I notice that any value from here that I'm doing blue going along never touches a graph. None of this is going to hit a graph. No matter what number I put in there, it will never hit that graph. But only until I get to this 2 does it start to do something, okay? So now I know that's going to happen, and it's going to keep going and going and going. No matter which way I put that goes down, I'm going to keep going and keep going. So where do I start? That's going to be the smallest number. Always the same thing, smallest to largest. The smallest number that we're going to start with right there is a 2. So we're going to have our union, and we're going to have a parentheses because it's an open circle. Okay, make sure your parentheses look like parentheses and your brackets look like brackets. It will be incorrect if you do that the other way, or if I can't tell what it looks like, I should say. And then, like I said, this graph was going, it kept going, and on this side of the graph, if this went down forever, these x values will eventually be on that graph. So this is going to go forever. When it goes forever, it's positive infinity. Again, a parentheses. So now the interval notation is this, and so now when we do our inequality, we have something with an infinity and something with an infinity here. So we're going to have to use, it's going to be x, because we're doing domain, and then we're going to determine, we know it's a -2. Now if it's this one here, I'm going to go, it's telling me all my values is less than or equal to -2. And then when I look at the other one, again, here's an x, I have a 2, I'm going greater than 2, because I'm going towards positive infinity, so, but it's just a greater than sign. Okay, so I'm going to erase all this here, and then I'm going to look at the range. Okay, so the range is only going to be these values here, this on this y-axis, okay? So what I want to do is I want to look at where does my lowest value start, okay? So if we do interval notation, and we see here that our lowest value right here is actually at here, because this is going down. So that means all these values from the y will be, values will be on this graph, okay? So that's going on forever for negative infinity, so we'll stop that. Negative infinity, comma, and then if I keep going to the y values, it goes all the way up to this 3, okay? And if I hit it on the graph that's right here that I'm looking at on the right, that's going to be a open circle, but at 3. So it's going to be like that. Union. Now I'm going to go to look at the other graph. Well, the lowest part of the other graph, other side of the graph is going to be, and I'm going to use a different color, is going to be 3 as well. All right, 3. And I keep going up and up and up forever till positive infinity, but it's a bracket. To parentheses, and it's closed. Now the thing is let's look at this part right here. I have a number repeating. I seem to be repeating 3 and 3. Okay, since the 3 is repeating, and I need to determine if it's necessary to have both of these in intervals. So if this is not included, but I get to include it in here, that means 3 gets to be used. 3 gets to be used, and therefore that means 3 is part of the interval notation, and I don't need to write it twice, so I need to combine these two, okay? So I'm going to rewrite this, and I'm going to start with the smallest number, which is negative infinity, okay? And I'm going to go to the largest number, which is positive infinity. And if you think about it, inside this interval notation, 3 is in there, okay? So therefore, that's going to be what you write. So it's negative infinity to infinity. So you do not write both of these, so I'm going to erase the things, this one. Oops, wrong pen. And that's going to be our answer. Let's rewrite our answer. So our answer should be negative infinity to infinity. And we think about the interval notation. We have that. And so now that can help us write the inequality notation, which is just all real numbers, this fancy R. Number 5, okay? Again, make sure you can tell what your, I think this one's pretty easy to see where the X and Y axis is, but again, I'm just gonna do it for sake of showing what we're talking about. So we're gonna look at the X axis first. We're gonna do a domain, which are your X values. Okay, we're gonna go to the farthest number to the left that we get to use for the X values, and it looks like it's here at -4. -4 gets this graph, and it's an open circle, so we have -4. Okay, and then looking at this graph, okay, so if we take it and we keep thinking, okay, every X value is hitting this graph. When I pick an X value, I get something. Here at 0, when I pick an X value, I do land on the graph there and here. It doesn't, the graph does not have to be connected to keep going. As long as I keep hitting the graph at this value of X, and then it starts to go up into this upper graph. So therefore it keeps going on, and this arrow is telling me to go this way. So therefore I could just keep, can go this direction. So every X value going into the right forever and ever is going to work. And so that's going to be to positive infinity. Okay. I have a interval with an infinity sign, so I know this is going to be an X, and I know my number is -4. So which way I'm going? Well, this is showing that I'm going to positive infinity, so therefore all these values are greater than and not equal to, just greater than, because we have a parentheses there. Okay, let's look at range. Kind of erase this. Now for range, what we want to look at is the values of the y-axis only. So let me just highlight my y-axis this way. Okay, and then I want to talk about how low does it start to how high it goes. Okay, so when we look at the y values, and again, remember these are y values. Okay, so how low does this graph go? When I look at the y values, this is the lowest point, and that's at a -8. So I know it, and it's an open circle, so it has to be a parentheses. -8, and then I keep using this. So this graph at every value between here and then this point right here, which is a -4, is hitting this graph. So now I know that I'm going to go up to this -4, and it's closed because it's, so therefore it is a bracket. Okay, so now I have the part of this graph up here that I have to deal with. So when I'm looking at what's happening after that, okay, so if I'm going to go to that part of the graph, and if I think about values starting from -4 up, so right here, up here, there is no graph that I'm going to hit in this area. So I can't use any y values until I get to here, and that y value. So we have to have a union, and so we'll do union, and that y value starts at 0. Okay, so it is closed, so it's going to be 0. Now, this is going on forever. This graph goes on for this way. These y values will be used to hit that graph, so therefore it's going on to positive infinity. Okay, so again, look at the y values on the y-axis when you need that, and so forth, to be able to write your interval notation. So now let's use that to help us write our inequality. So the inequality for this one, I start with the -8 because there's two numbers, so I know my y value variable between. So it's x is less than, because it's parentheses, y, and then less than or equal to, because it is a bracket, -4, comma. And again, if I have only a number and an infinity sign, it's going to be y, and it's a bracket, so it's equal to, but it's greater than 0. All right, number 6, the same thing. All right, so when we look at this one, we're going to think about the smallest x value that I can have. And if I'm looking at this axis, it's right here, okay? And the smallest x value that I see that I can have looks like it's right here, which is a -5. So it starts this graph here, 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 then here. So I know I have a closed bracket. It's closed, so it's in bracket, and it starts at -5, and it's up to that negative. And what is this? This right here is -1. Okay, and it's a parentheses. Now, when I go on from there, I have this little part of a graph here, but then all these x values from here all the way to 2 will never hit a graph, so therefore those x values are never used. So I'm going to start at, I have a union, and I'm going to start at 2, and it's a bracket because it's a closed circle there, all the way up to this one right here, which is a 4, comma 4, and then also a bracket. Okay, write the interval. Two numbers, -5 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to, oops, I'm sorry, it's not less than or equal to, it's just less than -1, comma, and then we have 2, which is less than or equal to, because it's a bracket, x, which is less than or equal to 4. Now, just again, remember these domains mean what x values do I get to use to plug into an equation or function to get a y value out, okay? So now let's look at the range. With the range, we're dealing with just the y value, the y-axis, the y values. So I'm just going to use a highlighter again and see if I can see. I'm going to go this way. Okay. So now when we start with the smallest number we can, is down here. We want to start always smallest to largest. So down here, this is my smallest y value that starts. So I start at -8. And it's close, that's why I have a bracket. It's going to go up all the way to here to this -4. And it's also a bracket. Okay, so now let's look at up here where this other part is. So as I'm going along, these values there's no y value, there's no graph where these y values can be on that actual picture. So I'm going to go all the way up here, and I get to this value right here, and that value is where I get to actually start, okay? But it's only, if I were to draw this line straight out like this, you would know that that's an equation of some sort, okay? And it's at 4. So I only get to be 4, okay? Y values are only going to be 4 at that point when I have these x values. So when you write just a single number, okay, you're just going to actually use a bracket, and you're just putting the number in there. So it's brackets, it's 4. Because it's included, it has to be used, okay? So those are our values. So if we were to write now the the inequality, we're going to write it as, these are 2 numbers. So I'm going to start with -8. It is less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to -4. And then comma. Now, when you just have, like I said here earlier, what is this line? If we get it like this, y is always going to equal to 4. So this is where that y equals 4, where the equal sign is being allowed to be used. So let's look at number 7. Number 7, do we have any restriction? Look at the domain. Are any x values not being used? No, all of these x values through here we can see on the graph. But because this is going on up this way and going down this way, my x values will eventually hit that graph when I plug it in, substitute into the function, and get a value. It'll get there, but it doesn't show that. So if it's all those values, we know it's -infinity to infinity for our interval, and then it's just all real numbers, okay? Usually, when you have -infinity to infinity, the range is like that, but that's only if you have a function, and this graph is a function. So when we look at the range, and we look at this way, I'm too lazy to erase. So if we look at all these y values, they're going to be used. And this arrow again goes on forever this way and never this way, so that we know that again will be -infinity to infinity, and this is all real numbers. Number 8, just a little bit different. When you see something like this, hopefully you can see like a pattern is happening here. Okay, so there is kind of like an up and a down. So let's first talk about the domain. So what is the smallest number I get to use on this, looking at the x-axis? So going this way, we know the smallest number is this -1. Okay, and so when we look at what's happening with the graph, the x values will always be on this graph, no matter what x value I pick. And even if it's going on forever and ever, it's going down this direction, I know that I'm always going to be hitting that graph. So we know we can start our interval at -1. It's closed, so therefore we have a bracket, and it's going forever and ever to +infinity. Okay, how do we write this inequality? Remember, if it has an infinity, we're going to do the value of the variable, x. We know it's -1, and it's going towards +infinity, so it has to be greater than, and it's equal to, because it's a bracket. Okay, now let's look at the range. I'm going to erase this. Okay, when we look at the range is a little, not different, but what I want you to do is think about a pattern that you see here. Okay, so if I look at, and I just asked straight, what is the lowest number that you can go to right here? -3 that I see. My highest value looks like it's up here at 1. Okay, now I want you to kind of look at if you chose the lowest value to be -infinity for the range, because the graph keeps going, because there's a pattern. So this is one where you want to think about, look for a pattern, okay? And the pattern is happening if you see it comes up and it hits this 1, okay, hits this 1, comes down and hits this 3. Well, it's actually doing the pattern again. It's going to come up, hit this 1. And if you had more of the x values, if your graph was a little bit longer, the x-axis, you can come down, and it'll come down to this 3. Again, -3. So it does create a pattern. When you create that pattern, then you know that it's going to be like that. If it wasn't going to be a pattern, you would see some craziness happening after the range, and you would know for sure. So this is a pattern, and you want to make sure that you look at the graph and see a pattern. Okay, so now that means our interval notation, though, will only go from my smallest number is a -3 to my largest number, which is 1. And then I can write this as -3 less than or equal to y, which is less or equal to 1. All right, last one, okay? So again, starting the same way every time. You can look to the farthest to the left that you can go. Make sure again that you can tell what your axis looks like. I think this one's pretty good, so I'm just going to undo that so we can see it clearly. So I know that my x values, this arrow up here tells me it's going forever and ever this direction, so I can keep using these x values past -10 up to -infinity. So I'm going to go to -infinity. Okay, now let's see how far to the right I get to go. So again, what I always think about is every time these values that I use for x, I plug it in, I'm going to hit the graph, okay? Now, even on up to here on this side, but even this -4 and whatever, there are also values that come up and down both ways. And notice I keep going until I get to 4. Just a reminder that the graph does not have to connect in order to know if that x value keeps going, because I can go on 2 sides of this graph. I have a graph below and above, and the x value is still being used. It goes up to the 4, so I have a 4. Since it's open, it's going to be parentheses. Now I still keep going. I still have a little bit over here. So when I look at this side, and I look at what's happening, there's nothing at 5 like where this blue area is until I get to 6. Then at 6, I actually get to be part of this graph. So it's going to be a union, parentheses, 6, and it keeps going on forever. That arrow tells me to positive infinity. So now I have 2 intervals, and then again, there's infinity involved, so we're going to write x and x. The first one, we're going to go to a 4. Now it's from -infinity to 4, okay? So that is going to be anything less than that. And then the other side, this is going to be going to greater than 6. Okay, let's look at the range. Let me put a comma between those. All right, what's the interval? So I'm just going to erase all this because it gets in my way. So if I look at the interval notation of the range, how low does it go? So this goes all the way down to here, at this value here, which is a -8. It's closed, okay? And then now we're going to determine how it goes with all the way up to how far it goes. So again, I'm using my graph, my values, am I hitting a graph? Yes, all the way up to here. Now at 0, when y is 0, I'm still hitting a graph, and I keep going. And I get there, I'm hitting a graph, and all the way up, I will hit a graph. Doesn't matter which side it is, none of this is connected. So I started here at -8. There are no gaps on the y value. On the y-axis is going to keep me from having to do any more to this and make another interval or another number. So that means I'm going to go on to positive infinity. Okay, so then now I write my inequality. Y is greater than or equal to -8.